So picture a physician in ancient Rome. A patient is brought in with this massive, just heavily bleeding wound on their arm. And the physician, who is, operating under the absolute cutting-edge medical theory of the day, decides to apply a really tight tourniquet right above the injury.
Which, I mean, in a modern context, that makes total sense. You cut off the circulation to stop the bleeding.
Right, exactly. But
Yeah.
this Roman physician, he isn't thinking about circulation at all. He's thinking about atomic structures. He actually believes the human body is essentially this sponge made of invisible, really fragile corpuscles that are moving through tiny microscopic channels.
Oh, right, the theory of anermoi onkoi.
Yeah, that's the one. So he tightens the tourniquet, expecting to just block those invisible channels. But instead of stopping the blood, the tourniquet compresses the muscles equally. The pressure builds up, the underlying fluid is squeezed violently, and the blood literally just spurts out of both ends of the wound.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the patient bleeds to death way faster than if the doctor had just done nothing at all. And what's wild is another contemporary physician, a guy named Scribonius Largus, actually documented this exact scenario. He openly attacked these corpuscular doctors for causing patients to die out of, pure theoretical ignorance of fluid dynamics.
It is a pretty harrowing example of what happens when a brilliant theoretical model collides violently with clinical reality.
It really is. And it perfectly sets the stage for what we are doing today. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We have a massive, incredibly complex journey ahead of us. We are pulling from an exhaustive collection of research, specifically the Oxford Handbook of Science and Medicine in the Classical World. And the core premise we're exploring today is actually highly provocative.
Yeah, it's the assertion that there was unequivocally rigorous science in antiquity.
Right, which I feel like a lot of people might push back on initially.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a premise that requires us to immediately shed our modern biases. Kieser, the editor, argues quite forcefully that we have to drop our chronological snobbery.
That instinct to just look back and laugh at people in togas talking about humors or ghosts.
Precisely. If we are going to understand ancient science, we have to establish a fair baseline for what constitutes science in the first place. So Kieser lays out three fundamental assumptions that a society basically must hold.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have to believe that the world we observe actually exists and is knowable. Second, you must believe that we can share knowledge about this world with one another. And third, and this is really the crucial one, you must believe there is a specific way the world operates, and it is both meaningful and possible to construct models or reports that represent that reality better than other models do.
So basically, if a society is actively attempting to understand how the natural world works, and they're constructing logical models to convey that insight, they're doing science.
Exactly. It doesn't matter if they don't have an electron microscope or a particle accelerator. It's about the systematic framework.
Right. It's the intent and the method.
Yes. The terminology might change. Whether you use the modern English word science, the Greek epistemo, or similar concepts in Sanskrit or Egyptian, but the intellectual endeavor is the exact same. It is entirely valid to look at the ancient world and recognize their systems as natural philosophy or science.
And that is our mission for you listening today. We're asking you to completely forget what you think you know about the history of human discovery. We're not treating the classical world from the Mediterranean to the parallel brilliance in Mesopotamia, India, and China as some kind of museum of antiquarian oddities.
Right. No looking down our noses.
Exactly. Nor are we treating it as just a stepping stone, only patting the ancients on the back when their guesses happen to align with a modern textbook.
We really have to view this as an organic, evolving system of knowledge. It's an unbroken, vastly complex chain of observations and shifting paradigms that leads directly to our modern understanding.
I mean, if a brilliant mind in antiquity believed in a geocentric universe populated by living beings, regulated by four humors, they did so because the internal logic was incredibly sound, right? It held up to their daily observations.
Absolutely. They weren't just making wild guesses.
So, we're going to try to inhabit the minds of the ancients. But to understand the grand, sweeping, theoretical models of the Greeks, we actually have to rewind the clock a bit.
Yeah, we have to start much earlier.
Right, with the practical, administrative roots of science and earlier empires. Before you can formulate a unified theory of everything, you have to figure out how to feed your population.
Necessity truly is the mother of invention. If we look at Mesopotamia in the late 4th millennium BCE, The complex discipline we now refer to as Mesopotamian mathematics did not begin with abstract philosophers pondering the cosmos.
No, it began with accountants, didn't it?
Exactly. It began with the manager priests of the great temple economies.
Because you have these massive populations, centralized land distribution, and you have to assign rations in kind to thousands of workers.
Right. And you have to calculate the precise ingredients necessary for large-scale production of commodities, particularly beer.
Obviously beer, the foundation of civilization.
Honestly, yes. Mathematics and logographic scripts evolved completely side by side for this singular pragmatic purpose. They just needed to count grain and brew beer efficiently.
And out of that incredibly grounded physical necessity, they developed this highly sophisticated sexagesimal system, a base 60 place value system.
Which is mathematically gorgeous when you really think about it.
It is, because 60 is this incredibly highly composite number. You can divide it evenly by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30.
It makes calculating fractions for grain rations infinitely easier than our base 10 system.
Yeah, trying to divide 10 by 3 is a mess, but 60 by 3 is just 20. Clean and simple.
It was an elegant solution to an administrative nightmare. But what is truly remarkable is that they didn't stop at simple arithmetic.
Once they had the tools, they just kept going.
Yes, once the mathematical tools were in place, human curiosity basically took over. We see the development of what we would absolutely recognize today as early algebra and geometry.
Like those geometric riddles concerning the properties of rectangles, right?
Exactly. The scribes were solving complex problems involving a given area and some linear constraint. They weren't just counting bags of grain anymore, they were manipulating abstract space.
And that foundational work in Mesopotamia likely provided the very inspiration for Euclid's Elements thousands of years later.
Oh, it's a direct lineage, without a doubt. But while their mathematics seems instantly recognizable to us, their approach to the human body often gives modern readers a bit of pause.
Yeah, this is where it gets a little weird for us. Mesopotamian medicine introduces a fascinating division of labor. You had two distinct types of medical experts working in tandem, the Asu and the Ashipu.
Right.
Let's unpack these two, because this is where the ancient worldview really challenges that definition of science we just set up. The Asu functions essentially as a pharmacist or a physical healer.
Roughly analogous to the later Greek pharmacopoeias, yeah.
Right. They are dealing with the tangible stuff,
Mhm.
grinding herbs, applying poultices, treating wounds directly. But then you have the Ashipu, who acts as the diagnostician and, crucially, the exorcist.
The exorcist. Yeah, the Ashipu was the intellectual authority in the medical hierarchy, analogous to the Greek iatros, or doctor.
Okay, but wait. If we are operating under the definition that science requires constructing models that represent reality, the Ashipu is out here attributing diseases to angry gods, restless ghosts, or demons.
It does sound counterintuitive.
Diagnosing a fever as the hand of a ghost feels like the exact opposite of empirical science. I feel like you need to defend this.
Right. I will defend it because it only feels unscientific until you understand the underlying mechanics of their diagnostic process.
Okay, hit me.
Attributing a disease to a specific supernatural entity was not a random guess or a primitive superstition. It was a highly structured classification system. The ancient Mesopotamians were deeply empirical. They actively recognized concepts like contagion.
So how does a ghost fit into empirical observation?
Think about how a modern physician works. A patient presents with a fever, a specific type of rash, and joint pain. The doctor aggregates that specific cluster of symptoms and assigns it a name, a syndrome.
Like saying, oh, you have chickenpox.
Exactly. The Ashipu was doing the exact same thing. They had a massive standardized text, the Diagnostic and Predictive Series, which was rigorously standardized by around 1050 BCE. It evaluated illnesses systematically from head to toe.
Covering everything from neurology and fevers to obstetrics and pediatrics, right?
Yes, all of it. So when the Ashipu observed a very specific recurring cluster of symptoms, they obviously lacked the vocabulary of cellular pathology or virology to name it.
They didn't know what a virus was.
Right. Instead, they used their cultural framework. Saying it was the hand of Ghost X was essentially their medical nomenclature for a specific pathogen or syndrome.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and that designation dictated a very specific prognosis and a standardized treatment protocol.
So the invisible force is really just a placeholder for the invisible microbe. They knew what the disease looked like and how it behaved. They just mapped the why to the supernatural forces they believed governed their reality.
Exactly.
That completely reframes the entire practice. It's actually brilliant.
It was a highly logical model based on meticulous observation. And we see an equally sophisticated, holistic system evolving in ancient India with the development of Ayurveda.
Right, the roots of Ayurveda stretch back to the Indo-European Vedic period, roughly 1500 to 500 BCE, and you see a similar trajectory there.
You do.
Initially, diseases are attributed to external supernatural forces and treated with mantras or ritual magic. But parallel to that, you get the emergence of these incredibly nuanced physiological concepts.
The most prominent being prash, the concept of circulating breath or vital energy.
The idea that invisible dynamic forces maintain the internal equilibrium of the human body.
Yes. And over centuries, this lore wasn't just passed down anecdotally, it was rigorously systematized into these massive compendiums.
The two foundational texts here are the Karaka Sahita and the Sushruta Sahita. And the sheer scale of these works is just staggering.
It really is.
The Karaka Sahita emerges from the Atreya school, and its primary focus is internal medicine. We are talking about 120 chapters of exhaustive medical philosophy.
It leaves almost nothing out. It covers general theory, etiology, which is the detailed study of the causes of disease pathology, and anatomy.
It even has an entire section, the Shudrasthana, completely dedicated to philosophical, anatomical, and embryological expositions.
They were theorizing deeply about fetal development.
And methods for predicting death, aphrodisiacs, and the incredibly precise preparation of emetic and purgative drugs. It's so thorough.
And while the Karakasaita mapped the internal world, the Sukrita Sahita, which originated from the Dhanukheminari school, prioritized the structural physical interventions.
Meaning surgery.
Yes, they put the branch of Sigya, or surgical treatments, at the very forefront.
Their surgical knowledge was astonishing. And to round it all out, the text includes a supplemental section, the Uttara Tantra, which covers everything from treatments of the neck and head to pediatrics and even mental disorders.
Which, interestingly, they categorized under demonology, very similar to the Mesopotamian naming conventions we just talked about.
Right, the same placeholder concept. And they even covered Tantra Yukti, which is the formal logic required for academic debate and scientific writing.
These weren't just collections of, loose folk remedies. They were comprehensive syllabi representing a complete philosophy of how a human being functions as a microcosm within the universe.
Which brings us to a massive intellectual pivot. We've seen these highly practical, deeply empirical systems of symptom management and structural medicine in the East. But how do we bridge the gap between treating a specific fever and trying to formulate a unified theory of everything?
That's the big jump.
Right. That brings us to the Mediterranean and the overarching theoretical obsession of the ancient Greeks.
The Greeks really shifted the focus from the purely practical to the fundamental why. And you cannot understand Greek natural philosophy without understanding their mathematicians.
Specifically the Pythagoreans and subsequently Plato.
Yes. The fundamental shift here is the belief that the universe isn't just organized. It is, at its very core, made of mathematics.
Which is such a modern physics concept, honestly.
It is. Archytas is a perfect example of this. He was a Pythagorean who tackled the famous Delian problem, which was the geometric challenge of doubling the volume of a cube.
Which, if I remember correctly, is physically impossible to solve using only a straight edge and a compass on a flat 2D plane.
Exactly right. If you have a cube with a volume of 1 and you want a cube with a volume of 2, you can't just double the sides because then the volume becomes 8.
2 times 2 times 2.
Right. Archytas solved this by moving completely out of two-dimensional thinking. He used complex, intersecting, three-dimensional shaped cylinders, cones, and toruses to find the exact mathematical proportions.
That is mind-bending for that era.
It's incredible geometry. But beyond his geometric brilliance, Archytas fundamentally reorganized how humans approach knowledge itself.
How so?
He divided the study of science into 4 distinct disciplines: astronomy, geometry, logistic, which was the science of calculation, and music. For Archytas, to truly know a thing was to know its underlying numerical ratio.
And Plato takes this Pythagorean obsession with mathematics and builds an entire reality-altering metaphysics out of it.
He sure does.
This is where the ancient mindset becomes almost alien to us, because Plato starkly divides reality into 2 realms. On one side, you have the world of particulars.
Right. The particulars are everything we can touch, see, smell, or hear. It is the material world.
The stuff around us?
Exactly. But because the material world is constantly changing, trees grow and rot, water freezes and melts, bodies age. Plato argues that you can never have absolute knowledge of it. You can only ever form opinions about physical matter.
Because how can you claim to know a universal truth about a leaf when the leaf is going to turn brown and fall apart tomorrow?
Precisely. So Plato posits a second realm, the forms. The forms are intellectual, immaterial, completely unchanging concepts.
Like the mathematical ideal of a circle.
Yes, or the pure concept of justice. For Plato, the forms possess actual being, whereas the physical world is just in a constant, messy state of becoming.
The epistemological implications of this are massive,
Yeah.
right? Because if the physical world is just a shifting shadow, then empirical observation, going out and measuring things with your hands, is ultimately a flawed way to pursue true science.
It is under his system.
Let me try out an analogy here for the listeners. It's kind of like a video game.
Okay, I like this.
When a player is running around in a digital world, they're looking at the screen, they see the sky, the buildings, maybe the graphics glitch a bit, the frame rate drops. That visual output is the world of particulars.
Yeah.
It's sensory, it's shifting, it's ultimately an illusion.
Right.
But the true reality of that game, the entity that actually dictates every rule, every boundary, every interaction, is the underlying source code, the mathematics written by the programmer. That code never changes. That is Plato's forms.
That analogy holds up perfectly. In fact, when Plato wrote the Timaeus, his grand treatise detailing the physical creation of the cosmos, he explicitly referred to his own physical descriptions as an aikos mythos, a likely story.
Because he knew he was just describing the glitches on the screen.
Exactly. He knew that describing the physical world was just a shadow play. True science, for the Platonists, meant turning away from the sensory world and contemplating the pure underlying code.
But science didn't stay locked in the realm of pure abstract thought forever. Because Aristotle steps onto the scene, looks at Plato's immaterial forms, and fundamentally rejects the premise.
Aristotle is basically the inventor of natural science as we recognize it today.
He insists that the stuff right in front of us actually matters.
He brings Greek thought back down to earth. He doesn't completely abandon the need for grand structures, but he reorganizes knowledge into a threefold system based on reality.
So what's his system?
You have practical disciplines like ethics and politics, which govern human action. You have productive disciplines, the arts and crafts that allow us to build artifacts. And finally, the theoretic disciplines, mathematics, theology, and most importantly, natural science.
And Aristotle's natural science dominated human thought for millennia. I mean, to understand it, we have to grasp his theory of the elements: earth, water, air, and fire.
But it's not simply a periodic table, it is a highly dynamic system of behavior.
Right, because Aristotle defines the elements by fundamental interacting qualities, hot or cold, and wet or dry.
Yes, fire's hot and dry, water is cold and wet, but the true genius of his system is that he assigns every element a natural place in the cosmos.
This is my favorite part, because this is how he explains gravity and motion without needing a concept of Newtonian gravity.
It's brilliant. Earth and water possess a centripetal force. They have an inherent internal drive to move toward the center of the universe, which, in his geocentric model, is the center of our planet.
Like Earth.
Yes. Conversely, air and fire possess a centrifugal force. Their natural state is to move outward, away from the center.
So when you drop a rock, it doesn't fall because an invisible force is pulling it down. It falls because the element of earth within the rock is expressing its natural desire to return home to the center.
Exactly.
And fire reaches up toward the sky because it's trying to return to the periphery. It is an incredibly beautiful, cohesive logic.
It really is. And to account for the eternal, unchanging circular motion of the stars and planets, he posits a fifth element, the aether, whose defining characteristic is continuous circular movement.
And he applies this same rigorous desire for order to biology, right?
Yes, he creates the scala naturae, the great ladder of nature. Plants possess the basic capacities for nutrition and reproduction. Animals have those, plus the capacity for perception and movement. And humans have all of that, crowned with the capacity for reason.
But the absolute bedrock of Aristotelian science is teleology, the final cause.
Right. Aristotle firmly believed that nature does nothing in vain.
To truly understand a biological organ or a physical process, you cannot just describe what it is made of. You must explain its purpose. What is the end goal?
Yes, the final cause is everything. And when you apply teleology to specific biological functions, you get some surprisingly modern-sounding theories.
Like what?
Take his epigenetic model of reproduction. He didn't know what DNA was, obviously, but he theorized that male semen and female menstrual blood contain specific movements or vital heat that stemmed directly from the grandfathers and grandmothers.
Wow.
These movements lay dormant until activation, forming the physical traits of the embryo. He is conceptually describing genetic inheritance.
That's crazy close to the truth. And his physiological explanations extended into human consciousness as well. His theory of dreams is remarkably mechanistic.
He argued that dreams are essentially the remnants of sense perceptions gathered during the waking hours.
So like sensory echoes.
Yes. These sensory ripples remain present in the blood. When a person sleeps, external sensory input shuts down, and internal heat pushes these remnant ripples to the surface of the sensory organs, creating the experience of a dream.
It is a strictly physical explanation for a psychological phenomenon. No gods whispering in your ear, just heat and blood.
Exactly. But even with Aristotle's massive influence, his teleological view of a purposeful universe wasn't universally accepted. We really have to talk about the great counter-movement here.
The atomists, Epicurus and Democritus.
Right. If Aristotle says every leaf falls and every bird sings because of a fundamental final purpose, the atomists look at the universe and say, absolutely not.
Epicurus argues for strict, unyielding materialism.
The entire cosmos consists of only two things: infinite, indivisible bodies called atoms, and the infinite void in which they move.
Atoms in the void. No grand design. No divine architect. Just infinite particles crashing into each other, hooking together to form stars, planets, and people, and eventually falling apart again.
Yes, and to account for human free will in a purely mechanical universe, Epicurus introduces the swerve.
The swerve.
Yeah, the idea that atoms occasionally randomly deviate from their paths, just a tiny unpredictable swerve that breaks the chain of pure determinism.
But Epicurus's worldview brings up a fascinating contradiction, right? Here is a philosopher who has conceptually deduced the atomic structure of the universe, yet he is famously hostile toward other scientific disciplines, particularly applied mathematics and astronomy.
He really was.
Which seems insane to me. I mean, if you figure out the universe is made of atoms, why would you hate the people trying to map the stars?
It does seem contradictory. But for Epicurus, the ultimate goal of philosophy and science was not the accumulation of abstract truth. The goal was ataraxia.
Which is tranquility, or absolute peace of mind.
Exactly. He believed that the primary source of human misery was the fear of the gods and the fear of death.
Okay, so how does astronomy cause anxiety?
Epicurus employed a method we can call regionalized skepticism. His primary rule for truth was direct perception. If you can touch a rock, you can know the rock.
Sure.
But astronomy deals with objects millions of miles away. You cannot directly perceive the mechanics of the sun. Therefore, presenting one single, absolute mathematical model for the heavens is arrogant.
Oh, I see.
Worse, it makes the astronomer act like a god, and it causes anxiety for the layman. Epicurus preferred to offer a menu of possible physical explanations for celestial events, just to prove that you didn't need a divine being to explain them.
So the exact mechanism didn't matter, as long as it wasn't a god throwing lightning?
Right. If it's atoms bumping or wind or whatever, fine. Just don't tell me Zeus is mad.
That is profound. He is essentially subjugating scientific certainty to mental health.
The ultimate goal is just to chill out.
Relax, guys. It's just atoms. And he lived this philosophy to the absolute extreme. The sources share this incredible detail about his death. He is dying in just terrible agony, suffering from strangury and dysentery.
Yes.
But he writes a final letter to his friend Idomeneus. He says that despite the immense physical pain, his life is still fundamentally happy because the mental joy of remembering their past philosophical discussions completely outranks his bodily suffering.
He believed his mental focus literally overrode physical reality.
That is wild.
It perfectly encapsulates the intellectual diversity of the classical world. You have Plato declaring that reality is pure mathematics, Aristotle arguing for a purposeful universe of elements, and Epicurus insisting on random atoms and mental tranquility.
But this diversity of physics creates a massive problem when we move from the lecture hall to the sickbed.
It really does.
I mean, if you are a doctor in ancient Rome and a patient comes in burning up with a fever, how do you treat them? Does their body consist of Aristotelian elements or Epicurean atoms? We have to look at how these high-level physics translated into pharmacology and physiology.
And to bridge that gap, we have to look at the theoretical foundations of alchemy.
Oh, this is fascinating.
Because how you conceptualize matter dictates how you attempt to transform it. The alchemists leaned entirely on Aristotle's physics, specifically his concept of houle.
Houle is this fascinating idea of a quality-less substrate, right? It is base matter that has no inherent properties until it receives the qualities of hot, cold, wet, or dry.
Exactly. If all matter, whether it's lead, gold, or human flesh, is fundamentally just this neutral hule mixed with different ratios of fundamental opposites, then transformation is entirely logical.
Right, if you can change the internal ratio of hot to cold, you literally change the substance.
Yes. The alchemists theorized about exhalations. They believed the earth produced a moist, vaporous exhalation and a dry, smoky exhalation. These exhalations became trapped within the earth, condensing to create metals and stones.
So turning lead into gold isn't Harry Potter magic. It's just applied Aristotelian physics. You just need to figure out how to adjust the smoky exhalations.
That's all it is to them. But when this theoretical debate turned to human medicine in the Roman Empire, it spawned fierce, warring factions, the medical sects.
Because medicine wasn't a unified, standardized profession back then. It was deeply fractured based on underlying philosophy.
Very fractured. You had the rationalists, who were the closest to modern theoretical researchers. They believed you had to uncover the hidden causes of disease.
So they relied heavily on theoretical frameworks and detailed anatomical study.
Yes, including dissection, to understand the internal mechanics.
But then you had the empiricists, who looked at the rationalists and said, "You're overthinking it."
Totally. The empiricists completely rejected the search for hidden causes. They didn't care why a drug worked, they only cared that it worked.
Which is very practical.
They relied purely on past experience and observation. If willow bark cured a headache yesterday, use it again today.
And beyond those two, you had the pneumatists, who focused entirely on the vital breath, the pneuma, flowing through the body. And you had the Methodists, who reduced all disease to a simple physical binary.
Right. The body's internal structures were either too tense or too relaxed.
And right in the middle of this chaotic medical landscape, we meet Asclepius of Bithynia, the physician we talked about at the very beginning of the deep dive.
The tourniquet guy.
The tourniquet guy. He was heavily influenced by Epicureanism. He looked at the human body and didn't see humors or exhalations. He saw atoms.
His theory of anermoi onkoi. He believed the body was a mass of fragile corpuscles moving continuously through a network of invisible channels, or poroi.
So for Asclepiades, disease wasn't an imbalance of hot and cold. It was entirely mechanistic. It was an impaction and emphraxis of these corpuscles getting jammed in the channel.
Like a microscopic traffic jam.
Which leads directly to the tourniquet disaster. Because if you believe bleeding is just corpuscles flowing through pipes, you assume you can just clamp the pipe.
But Scribonius Largus, operating from a different framework, observed the actual fluid dynamics and realized Asclepiades' atomic model was lethal in practice.
It is a brutal intellectual battleground. People were dying over these philosophical debates. And this warring, fractured state of medicine sets the stage for the arrival of the Titan, Galen.
Galen.
The man whose synthesis would literally write the medical rule book for the next 1,500 years.
Galen achieved dominance through a monumental, exhaustive intellectual synthesis. He didn't just align with one sect, he systematically wove the greatest hits of Greek philosophy into one massive, cohesive medical framework.
Okay, so what did he pull together?
Well, he took the foundational four humors, blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm, straight from Hippocrates.
And he took the tripartite structure of the soul directly from Plato.
Yes, locating reason in the brain, spirit and emotion in the heart, and basic desire in the liver.
And crucially, he adopted teleology from Aristotle. Galen firmly believed that nature acts with absolute purpose.
He built his anatomical system on three progressive levels of organization. First, the homeomerous structures tissues of uniform composition like bone, nerve, or cartilage.
Okay.
Second, organic structures, compounds of those simple tissues that serve a very specific teleological function like the stomach or the eye. And third, the complete unified body.
But Galen wasn't just, a peaceful archivist blending ideas together. He was vicious toward anyone who challenged his teleological view.
A very vicious.
He absolutely despised the mechanistic atomic models of doctors like Asclepiades.
He launched blistering written attacks against them. He also targeted Erostratus, a brilliant earlier anatomist who had proposed a mechanical theory of hor vacui. It was the idea that disease was caused by blood spilling over into the arteries, which naturally contained only pneuma, displacing the air and causing inflammation.
Interesting.
But Galen rejected these mechanical explanations entirely because they lacked purpose. For Galen, it wasn't enough to say atoms bumped into each other or fluid spilled over. You had to explain the divine, purposeful design behind the biological structure.
He demanded rigorous causal explanation derived from deep anatomical knowledge. He really demanded universal order.
He did.
Which makes for a fascinating contrast when we look at how botany and pharmacology were being documented around the same time.
Yeah.
In the first century Roman Empire, you have two massive figures attempting to catalog the natural world, Pliny the Elder and Dioscorides.
And they represent two entirely different philosophies of information gathering. Pliny compiles this colossal Latin encyclopedia, the Natural History.
But his methodology is highly suspect by modern standards.
Oh, very. He was an encyclopedist in the most uncritical sense. He swallowed written texts whole.
He was like the ancient equivalent of someone retweeting an article without reading past the headline and never checking the source.
That's a perfect description. Pliny layered genuine medical observation right alongside magical folklore, rank astrological linkages, and bizarre lore about snakes and insects. He gave almost every source equal merit.
Whereas Dioscorides, a Greek physician in the Roman army who wrote the Materia Medica, was the consummate field scientist.
He didn't just read books, he traveled. He painstakingly analyzed over 700 simple drugs.
Oh, wow.
He documented their topographies, integrating multicultural knowledge from Gaul all the way to Egypt. He created a reasoned, highly empirical, balanced panorama of pharmacology based on direct observation.
Before we move on from the human body, I really want to highlight one of the strangest, most fascinating details regarding how they applied Greek logic to physical forms. Ancient physiognomy.
Oh, yes.
This was the practice of deducing someone's personality or moral character purely from their physical appearance. And what's wild to me is that they use strict Aristotelian syllogisms to justify it.
Structurally, it is a masterclass in formal logic, even if the premise is completely absurd.
Right, so the argument functions like this. Major premise, courage belongs to all beings that have large extremities. Minor premise, having large extremities belongs to all lions. Conclusion? Therefore, courage belongs to men with large extremities.
It is flawlessly logical.
It really is. If you accept the premise that a lion's courage is biologically linked to the size of its paws, then a guy with big hands must be brave.
It perfectly illustrates how an ancient scientific system can be structurally magnificent and logically sound while being empirically completely off base.
The logic engine runs perfectly, it's just the data input that is flawed.
Exactly. And this intense desire to find interconnected logical systems didn't stop at the boundaries of the human body. As we look upward, we see that the ancients viewed the entire macrocosm, the universe itself, as a massive, intimately interconnected machine.
So what happens when ancient science tackles the cosmos? We have to start with astrology.
And again, we have to drop our modern biases here. Hellenistic astrologia wasn't a newspaper horoscope predicting if you'll find love this week. It fully encompassed what we now call rigorous astronomy.
Astrology was viewed as an essential applied science. It was the study of the ultimate environmental factors.
Right. If the moon can physically pull the tides of the ocean, it stands to reason that the massive, eternal planets exert physical influence on the microfluids of the human body.
So astrology was deeply intertwined with high-level medicine.
Absolutely. The ultimate example of this is the practice of decumbiture. This completely bridges Galen's medicine with the stars.
How does that work?
If a patient fell severely ill, a highly trained physician astrologer would cast a precise mathematical chart for the exact hour and minute the patient took to their bed, the hour of decumbiture.
By calculating the intricate positions of the moon and the planets at that specific moment, they believed they could mathematically predict the critical turning points of the fever.
Yes, it was a profound attempt to emulate a mathematical ideal in medicine, tying the chaotic microchanges of a human illness to the perfect, predictable macro movements of the cosmos.
Everything is a mirror of everything else, and no one mapped those cosmic connections quite as beautifully as Ptolemy in the 2nd century CE.
Ptolemy is fascinating.
We usually only think of Ptolemy for his geocentric model of the universe, but his work on harmonics is just mind-bending. He actually mapped the physical universe to music.
The concept of the music of the spheres is a profound unifying theory. Ptolemy argued that harmonic ratios apply to anything of a perfect rational nature, which primarily means the human soul and the heavens,
So he started with the three main musical concords, the octave, the fifth, and the fourth.
which are pure mathematical ratios of 2 to 1, 3 to 2, and 4 to 3.
Yes, and Ptolemy maps those exact numerical ratios to the three parts of the Platonic soul, the thinking, perceiving, and animating faculties.
And then he takes those same musical intervals and maps them to the orbital motions of the planets.
It's incredible. He provided exhaustive numerical tables of these attunements, verifying his math with complex physical instruments like the monochord. He basically built a grand unifying theory of psychology, music, and astrophysics.
It is poetic physics. But Ptolemy wasn't just dealing in abstract planetary music, he was a serious physical experimentalist. His work in optics is incredibly rigorous.
Right, he conducted physical experiments with visual rays to understand objective optical illusions.
He was deeply fascinated by phenomena like diplopia or double vision. He constructed a specific experimental apparatus, a short ruler fitted with two cylindrical pegs.
And he mapped out how each eye projects a specific visual cone. He recognized that a single physical object is only perceived as one coherent image when the central axis of both visual cones aligns perfectly upon it.
Yes, if you shift the object off that axis, the geometry breaks and you experience double vision.
He also dove deep into catoptrics, the complex geometry of mirrors and reflection. He built upon Euclid's earlier laws to calculate the exact geometric angles of how a visual ray bends and refracts when it hits water or a polished surface.
It is hard, calculable physical science. But Ptolemy's complex models of the heavens lead us into a massive philosophical debate, one initiated by the historian Pierre Duhem in 1908.
The Duhem debate. This asks a fundamental question about the ancient scientific mindset. Were astronomers like Ptolemy realists or instrumentalists?
This is the crux of how we view their intelligence.
Let's break that down. A realist believes that their mathematical theory exactly corresponds to physical reality.
Right. If Ptolemy's math requires a massive crystalline sphere carrying the planet Mars on a smaller spinning epicycle, a realist believes there is a literal physical glass sphere grinding away in the sky.
An instrumentalist, however, doesn't care if the spheres are physically real. They use the math merely to save the phenomena.
Meaning the mathematical model is just a highly complex, convenient fiction designed purely to accurately predict where Mars will be next Tuesday.
So the debate is, did Ptolemy actually believe the sky was filled with giant invisible gears, or was he just using a brilliant math trick?
While the debate is still somewhat ongoing, the consistency across Ptolemy's entire body of work, his Almagest, his harmonics, his planetary hypotheses, strongly suggests he was a realist.
He really believed it.
He deeply believed in the physical, rational, interconnected structure of the cosmos. He wasn't just number crunching, he was describing reality as he understood it.
And speaking of physical structures, we have to talk about mechanics. Because ancient scientists weren't just passively observing the world, they were actively building machines to alter it.
They were engineers.
There's this wild, almost prophetic passage from Aristotle where he fantasies about automated, lifeless instruments.
Aristotle categorized tools into two types: living tools, like a helmsman on a ship or a slave, and lifeless tools, like a wooden rudder.
And in his writings, he imagined a utopian future where lifeless instruments could anticipate human needs. He wrote, "If the shuttle would weave and the plectrum play the lyre itself, we wouldn't need subordinates or manual labor."
In the 4th century BCE, he was conceptually predicting industrial automation.
He imagined the automated loom 2 millennia before the Industrial Revolution. It's crazy.
And then you have engineers like Archimedes actually bringing complex mechanics to life. He designed highly calculated, mathematically precise catapults that terrified the Romans.
And he engineered the Saracosia, the absolute largest freighter ship of the ancient world. They deeply understood force, mass, and mechanical advantage.
And we must ensure we don't view this explosion of complex mathematics and engineering as an isolated Mediterranean phenomenon.
Right.
The research explicitly highlights parallel developments in Chinese mathematics, particularly treatises compiled prior to the Sui dynasty, around the 6th century CE.
The parallels are striking. The ancient Chinese mathematicians were tackling the exact same heavy lifting computational problems we see in Greece.
Yes. They were calculating incredibly accurate approximate values of pi, deducing the complex volumes of pyramids and spheres, and developing methods to solve simultaneous linear equations.
It serves as a profound demonstration that when any complex society needs to solve advanced administrative, engineering, or astronomical problems, human intellect independently arrives at these sophisticated mathematical models.
Regardless of geography or cultural contact.
Which is incredibly affirming for the human species. But history, unfortunately, is not a steady, unbroken upward climb. Empires inevitably fall.
They always do.
And this brings us to the final era we are exploring for you today, the preservation of knowledge. We are moving into late antiquity, roughly the 4th or the 7th century CE.
The classical world is really fracturing at this point.
The Roman Empire splits, barbarian invasions disrupt trade routes, religious tensions reshape society. The scientific mission fundamentally shifts. It's no longer about explosive, paradigm-shifting discovery. It becomes a desperate race for preservation.
The world was becoming deeply geopolitically unstable. The sheer volume of profound knowledge generated by Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and Ptolemy was at severe risk of being lost to the fires of collapsing cities.
So what do they do?
During this period, we see the rise of two massive intellectual movements designed to hold the line: the Neoplatonic commentators and the medical encyclopedists.
Let's look at the Neoplatonists first. These are philosophers like Simplicius, Philoponus, and Proclus.
Their goal wasn't to invent a brand new physics from scratch. Their goal was to harmonize the giants of the past.
They wanted to reconcile Aristotle's grounded physical mechanics with Plato's lofty immaterial metaphysics.
And this harmonization effort produced some incredibly profound philosophical debates about the very nature of nature itself. A prime example is the intense debate between the earlier commentator Alexander of Ephroditus and the later Neoplatonist Simplicius regarding the concept of abiogenesis.
Spontaneous generation. The specific, rather visceral example they debated was the ancient belief that hornets spontaneously generated from the rotting bodies of dead horses.
Which sounds gross to us, but it was a serious scientific question. Alexander argued that this phenomenon proved that nature sometimes acts purely mechanically, without a conscious creator or a higher Platonic model guiding it.
A rotting horse doesn't intend to create a hornet, it just happens as a byproduct of decay.
Exactly. But Simplicius leverages a brilliant Neoplatonic defense to maintain order in the universe. He argues that even if the active producer, the rotting horse, has no conscious cognition of a hornet, the process is still guided by a higher pre-existing intelligible form.
Simplicius argues that nature acts, quote, according to a model which is not established as something known by the producer, but because the producer makes the product like itself by being, not by choosing.
It's a deep concept.
I love the analogy often used for this. It's like a signet ring being pressed into hot wax. The wax has no idea what the ring looks like, and the ring isn't making a conscious choice to draw a picture, but the form is transferred perfectly through the act of being.
It is brilliant philosophical gymnastics. They are stretching Aristotelian physics to fit into a grand descending chain of spiritual and intellectual causes.
It opens the door to a more supernatural causation, which fit the shifting religious tones of late antiquity, while strictly keeping the rigorous framework of Aristotle's four causes intact.
But while the philosophers were debating the metaphysical origins of hornets and horses, the doctors on the ground were dealing with a much more urgent crisis.
Right, they were trying to make sure the average physician didn't forget how to cure a headache or set a broken bone as the libraries burned.
Enter the encyclopedists.
The encyclopedic tradition actually started centuries earlier with the Romans. You had figures like Varro, who compiled the Disciplinae, a vast categorization of knowledge that likely evolved into the medieval seven liberal arts.
And Celsus wrote De Medicina, a brilliant masterwork preserving Greek dietetics, pharmacology, and surgery.
And Vitruvius wrote exhaustively on architecture, heavily promoting the concept of utilitas vitae.
Human utility. Vitruvius argued that architecture wasn't just about building pretty columns, it had to fundamentally adapt to nature and climate.
He even incorporated Epicurean optics into his architectural designs to adjust for visual illusions in temples, ensuring the columns looked straight to the human eye. It was deeply holistic, practical science.
But as we reach the Byzantine era, the compilation efforts become truly mammoth in scale. We see the emergence of figures like Oribasius, Aetius, and Alexander of Tralles.
Now, for a long time in modern history, scholars looked down on these men. The historian Vivian Nutten famously referred to them as the medical refrigerators of antiquity.
Right, the implication being that they were just coldly storing old, frozen facts without actually understanding or advancing the science.
But looking at the sources we have today, that idea is completely dismantled. They weren't passive refrigerators. Think of them more as master archivists, desperately building the world's first open-source medical wikis during a time when the servers were literally catching fire.
That is a much more accurate analogy. Take Oribasius. The Emperor Julian the Apostate personally ordered him to search out and collect the principal writings of all the best physicians to ensure the completeness of the art.
Oribasius didn't just copy texts blindly. He had to evaluate, organize, synthesize, and condense centuries of complex medical literature.
Largely sourced from the Great Library in Alexandria before it was irrevocably lost.
And what's truly fascinating is how the physical structure of these encyclopedias evolved based on what the end users actually needed in a collapsing society.
Galen loved organizing his treatises, theoretically. or strictly anatomically from head to toe a capitated calces.
Galen wanted you to understand the entire philosophical cosmos before you treated a cough.
But the Byzantine compiler Alexander of Tralles changes the format entirely. He was an older man, a deeply seasoned clinical practitioner, writing for practical use in a difficult time.
He intentionally broke down those monolithic theoretical presentations into thematic, ad hoc compilations.
He created highly user-friendly, self-contained medical entries.
You look up a symptom, and the entry includes the diagnosis, the treatment, the drugs needed, and even physika, the local folk remedies and amulets that a rural doctor might have to rely on if they couldn't access Galen's rare imported herbs.
He wasn't abandoning the science, he was fiercely prioritizing utility. If a patient is suffering, the frontline physician doesn't have time for a high-level theoretical debate on Epicurean corpuscles versus Aristotelian humors.
They need a readily accessible, easily searchable database of every known remedy, sorted by immediate symptom.
This compilation work was a vigorous, intellectually laborious process that successfully conjoined high theoretical tradition with desperate current practice.
They were holding the line. They were encoding the sum total of classical medicine into a durable, accessible format that could survive the impending Dark Ages.
These encyclopedias were eventually translated into Syriac, Arabic, and Latin, keeping the intellectual flame of humanity alive for centuries until it could ignite the Renaissance.
So if we step back and synthesize this truly epic journey from the manager priest meticulously counting beer rations in Mesopotamia to the Vedic surgeons macking vital energy in India, to Aristotle's grand purposeful cosmos, Galen's exhaustive anatomical masterwork, and finally the desperate meticulous preservation efforts by the Byzantine encyclopedists, what is the ultimate takeaway?
The takeaway is exactly what Paul Kaiser promised us at the very start of this journey. Ancient science was not a random series of lucky guesses hidden among primitive, superstitious rituals.
Not at all. It was a deeply logical, intensely rigorous, and highly systematic attempt to understand the natural world.
They utilized the tools, the mathematics, and the conceptual frameworks available to them to build complex models of reality. They demanded causal explanations, they fiercely debated methodology, they performed physical experiments.
By any metric, they were doing science.
They were just doing it with a different set of foundational assumptions.
And that brings me to a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over as we wrap up this deep dive into the classical mind.
It is a profoundly humbling thought when you really consider the scope of what we've discussed.
It is. Think about the brilliant, rigorous, undeniable genius of the minds of antiquity. Think about Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy. These were some of the smartest human beings to ever live.
Without a doubt.
And they believed completely, with absolute logical certainty, in the physical reality of the four humors, the centripetal force of the Earth, and a mathematically perfect geocentric universe. The internal logic of those systems was perfectly sound to them.
So, fast forward.
Imagine historians in the year 4000 doing a deep dive on our era. Which of our current, deeply held, universally accepted scientific truths will they look back on with the exact same fascination, wondering how we could have been so meticulously, logically wrong?
That is a question well worth keeping in mind the next time you look at a perfectly clean, modern diagnostic graph.
Exactly. Keep questioning, keep diving, everyone. We'll see you next time.